Hey guys, Charlie from Airplane Academy here. By the end of this video, you are going to know how much the private pilot's license costs and the specific details that go into that pricing so that you can better understand for your specific scenario a closer estimate of what it's going to run you. And then we're also going to cover 3 really actionable things that can save you money on this license. And I promise, even if you do the first one, I promise it will save you money. It definitely did for me. So let's dive right in. So the average price for the private pilot's license is about 10 grand. And this is different from a sports pilot's license to fly LSA or light sport aircraft. And so we can cover that in a separate video. That has some restrictions associated with it. It can actually be a really good idea for certain people in certain scenarios, but we're talking about the private license here. So it costs about 10 grand. But for every person you talk to that says it costs them more than that, you'll also run into someone who says it costs them a little bit less than that. For example, one of my buddies in Kansas, shout out to you, Matt, thanks for watching, just finished his private and it cost him about $8,300 in Kansas. And there's some good reasons as to why there's a range. And that's because you don't just write the FAA a check for 10 grand, go through the training, get your license. There's a lot of things that go into it. So all of that to say, it's really important that we cover each one of those things, or these variables, the things that you're gonna have to invest in to get the license so that you can have a better estimate as to what exactly it's going to cost you. So what are those things? The first thing is the actual plane. You're gonna be flying at least 40 hours by the regs, so you're gonna have to be renting an airplane or paying for an airplane in some capacity for those hours. You're also going to be paying for the instructor. You'll be paying for ground school. You'll be getting your medical certificate, and then you're also going to be paying for exams, both written exams and then your practical exam at the very end, also known as your check ride. Now you're also going to be acquiring some gear in the process of getting your license, but we're not really going to cover the costs associated with it in this video just because there's such a wide spectrum. I mean, you can get all the way through your private just borrowing gear, frankly, and then you can upgrade later on, or you can buy everything new out of the gate. And so there's a real wide range here. And so it's not something you absolutely have to pay for because there's some other options that you can pursue. But we just really just want to cover the actual expenses you have to incur to get your license here. So we're going to leave gear off to the side for the time being. So let's dive into each of these and talk about some of the drivers so we can better understand what it's going to cost you in your specific situation. Okay, so let's start with how much the airplane is going to cost you. Now there's 2 main things that drive the cost here. It's how many hours you need the airplane for, and then how much does that cost per hour. Now, to get your private pilot's license, you need at least 40 hours of flying, and that's made up of dual instruction and then also solo flight. So we're going to assume 40 hours here for how long you need the airplane for. Now, some people might take longer than that, and that's definitely one of the things we're going to cover in how to save money. But as a starting point, let's assume the 40 hours, which is the requirement for the license. The second component driving the cost of the airplane is the hourly rental rate. Now this is going to have a really wide range, but I would start with about $125 to $175 per hour as a baseline assumption. Now the biggest thing driving this cost is what type of airplane you're actually flying. There's going to be an enormous difference between a 50 or 60-year-old airplane you're renting versus a brand new 172 with a G1000 cockpit, right? That's probably going to be the biggest thing driving the cost differential. Geography could have a little bit to do with it, but really the type of airplane is going to be the biggest thing. One other thing to look out for and just reading the fine print is whether or not your rental rate is a wet or a dry rate. What this means is whether or not it includes fuel. And so if you're seeing a really, really low rate out there, I would just make sure that does include fuel, because there might be, that might not be kind of the total baked in cost of the rental. If you're saying, oh, I found one for 40 bucks an hour, well, just make sure it's actually 40 bucks an hour. There's more than likely some stuff on top of that. Most rentals that I've ever done have always been a wet rate, but that is going to be driving some of the variability, so you'll want to look into the fine print just a little bit. So if we total those up and assume 40 flight hours times either $125 or $175 per hour for the airplane, you get a range of about $5,000 to $7,000 just for the aircraft rental and getting your private pilot's license. Now this is still a lot of money, but to me that's kind of an encouragement that most of the $10,000 or so is actually going towards the airplane itself. It's not just going to wasted kind of overhead and that sort of thing. You're actually getting to be in the airplane, which is what you're trying to do in the first place. So to me, it's still a lot of money, but at least it's going to something that you're actually wanting to do. The second component of your private pilot's license cost is the instructor. Now, as of this filming, of the 40 required flight hours you have to get your private, 30 of those have to be flown with an instructor. Now, there's going to be a wide range in how much an instructor costs you per hour. In my own experience, it's been about $35 to $75 per hour. Now, one thing to ask your flight school or your one-off instructor is, am I going to be charged for just the time that I'm flying with you, or does kind of the pre-flight briefing and post-flight briefing, am I also being charged for that? In my own experience, unless I'm needing to do kind of a separate one-off, hey, we're just spending a few hours on ground school here, if it's just a flight lesson, I was only charged for instructional time when the prop was spinning, and kind of the pre-flight and post-flight was kind of wrapped into that. And if I had to do, again, a couple hours of ground or something, then I would be charged for that. But you'll just want to do a little bit more research in your situation to better understand what exactly you're paying for. But if we total up those ranges of $35 to $75 an hour times the 30 required instructional hours, we get a range of about $1,000 to about $2,200 for the instructor. Now, one thing worth noting here is that the airplane cost and the instructor cost might not actually be separately called out depending on your situation. For example, if you're working with a flight school, a lot of times they'll kind of sell you a package and they'll just kind of give you a blended rate. And so I would just ask for a little bit more detail as to, how much of this is going towards the airplane, how much is going towards the instructor, how am I going to be charged with the instructor, is the pre-flight and post-flight briefing going to be added onto that, et cetera, et cetera. So you can just better understand exactly what you're paying for. The third thing you'll be paying for is ground school. Now, I'm not talking about the type of ground school that's kind of in the pre and post-flight briefing. I'm talking about the dedicated ground school that's getting you ready for your written exam. In order to take your written, you have to have an endorsement from an instructor saying that you are ready to, in fact, take this. And so there's a few different ways to accomplish ground school. Two of the ways that I've done it have been through online programs like a King Schools, which I've really, really loved, and you can do at your own pace, and they'll send you an endorsement at the end. Or you can also do, like an intensive ground school weekend. I did this at American Flyers here in Dallas a couple times. There was a 3-day weekend, and you're working every day like 8 to 6 on ground school and just cranking through the material, and you take your written at the end. And I found that really, really effective also. There's a bunch of different ways to do it. You kind of just want to focus on your own learning style if you like to do it kind of remotely and at your own pace, or if you want to be in person so you can ask someone questions face to face, that sort of thing. But kind of the range here is about $250 to $500 for ground school, depending on whether you do it online or in person as a weekend, that sort of thing. There's lots of different ways to do it here, but that's probably kind of a starting range of how much it's going to cost you. The fourth thing you'll be paying for is your medical certificate. Now, this is going to kind of vary based off of what type of medical you're getting, whether a third or second or first class medical, and you'll learn about that in ground school as to why you would need any one of those. But a good starting range for this is about $75 to $200, and it'll vary a little bit based on your specific flight surgeon. The last thing you'll be paying for are the actual exams. Now, there's two main exams you'll be paying for, and it's almost three, but it's really just bucketed into two. And the first is your actual written exam, and then the second is your practical exam, also known as your check ride, which consists of an oral exam and then also your flight. And so in my mind, there's kind of three things you have to do. It's the written, the oral, and the flight, but those last two are actually kind of baked together in one expense. So really just two things you're paying for, the written and then the practical. As far as the written goes, as of this filming, it's $160 to take the exam. Now, the company that manages and administers all of these, if you take the test at one of their own testing facilities, it's a little bit cheaper. It's like $94 or $96. It's like a very specific amount, but it's about $95 versus the $160. But if you take it at one of their affiliate centers, like a lot of flight schools will be an affiliate and like an approved testing center, then count on the $160. Now, one interesting stat about the written exam I wanted to share is that back in 2019, the FAA reported that about 36,000 people took their private pilot license written exam, and it had a 91% pass rate with an average score of 83.5. And so if you're worried about having to incur that $160 expense again, I just want you to know the data is on your side. There's a very, very high pass rate with a pretty high passing score. It's not just, the average score is a 70, it's almost an 84. So there's a pretty good chance you won't have to take it a second time. Now for the practical exam, your actual check ride, this is going to have kind of a range, and it's just going to depend on your actual examiner. You can go ahead and ask your flight school or your instructor, the examiners that they like to work with, and they'll already know their fees. Generally, it ranges from about $400 to $500. You might find them for less than that, but that's a pretty good starting point. And so count on about $400 to $500 just to pay the examiner for the actual exam. And then you're also probably going to have to rent the airplane again at $125 to $175 an hour. Count on about 2 hours needing that airplane. It could be a little bit less. But if you total all of this up, $160 for the written, about $400 to $500 for the practical, and then 2 hours of renting the airplane at $125 to $175. You end up with about $800 to about $1,000 for all of your exams. So if we total all of these numbers up, you'll notice that we get a range of about $7,200 to about $11,000 for the private pilot's license. Again, I would say the average is probably closer to about 10 grand, but now that you kind of better understand all the drivers of the cost, you can start to fill these assumptions in with the own data that you're gathering as you're talking to flight schools and instructors and that sort of thing, and have a much more confident estimate as to what it's going to cost you. So now that we know about how much it costs, how do we bring this number down? Now I'm going to give you the top 3 ways that I've been able to do this in my own experience, but there's a lot of other ways to do it also. And I've put them in an article over at airplaneacademy.com. The link will be down in the description, or you could also just Google Airplane Academy Private Pilot's License Cost, and it'll come up there in the search results where I give you other ways, more so than just these 3, to save on it. But let's dive right into those. The first way to save money, and I would say this is absolutely the number 1 way you can save money, is to fly often. It sounds simple, but if we go back and look at the cost breakdown that we just went through, well, where does the majority of the cost come from in the private pilot's license? It's from the airplane and the instructor. It's actually doing the flying. And so if you're having to repeat lessons because you're only able to fly once a month or something, well, that's immediately going to add up to a very large amount. It can be several $100s per lesson just to go do it. And so if you're repeating, even if you have to repeat 4 or 5 lessons 2 times, that's easily $1,000 or more you're adding to it. And it doesn't have to be that way. So I would just encourage you to fly as much as you can. I remember when I was getting my instrument rating, I flew 2 to 3 times a week, and it was a little easier because I could do it at night after work in a way that, for the private, most of it's during the day. So I had a little bit of an advantage there. But I was able to fly several times a week consistently, and I cranked it out. I didn't have to repeat anything. And so I would just encourage you to find and dedicate a season that you can just crank through this. Because if you can't, and you're having to stop halfway or repeat stuff, man, it's just going to turn into a very, very expensive thing very quickly. The second way to save money is to inquire about buying in bulk or block hours. Some flight schools will give significant discounts if you pay for some or all of the expense up front, because the reality is a lot of students quit halfway through their training, and so flight schools and instructors are also trying to solve that problem. They want to have committed students. They want to have people that can make it to the end here and finish their rating, and a lot of times they're willing to financially incentivize that to happen. And so if you're in a financial position to do so, I would absolutely inquire about getting some bulk discounts. And it doesn't even have to be the entire rating. It can just be, hey, well, what if I pay for 5 hours or 10 hours up front instead of, all 40? I bet they're going to be willing to work with you. So the worst they can say is no. I would just definitely encourage you to ask. And the third way to save money is to choose a different airplane. There's a significant cost savings if you choose to train in a more basic aircraft than in like a brand new G1000 equipped aircraft. And some flight schools will also let you train in both. If they have both aircraft, I remember American Flyers, kind of offered to do some of your training in the G1000 and then most of it in kind of the typical 6-pack steam gauges, kind of more traditional cockpit and avionics suite. And that can be a good way to kind of get exposed to both, get training in both, but not have all your training be in a very, very sophisticated aircraft that ends up having a lot of costs associated with it. So where possible, consider just training in a different airplane. So with all of this information in mind, knowing that it's a significant financial investment, I have one question to ask you. Is now the right time for you to become a pilot? I put together a separate video that talks about 4 reasons you might consider waiting to become a pilot. Because it's a significant financial and time investment, I don't want anyone to get halfway through their license and realize, oh man, this isn't a good time to do this, or this isn't even for me. I would hate to have that happen. That'd be a waste of your time and money, and I don't want that for anyone. But I also want everyone to be able to pursue aviation because it's changed my life, and I think it can change yours also. So I'd encourage you to watch that video. The link will be up in the corner and down in the description, and I hope it helps you pursue aviation with just a little bit more confidence. So I hope to see you over in that video. Thanks so much for watching. I hope it was helpful. Leave me a comment down below if you have any questions. I'd be happy to talk with you down there, and we'll see you guys in the next episode.